Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's story begins with this photograph. It's a carte visite or visiting card about the size of a modern baseball card. This particular photograph is an advertisement for a photographer named G.W.J. Everhart, who operated a gallery in Manchester, Maryland, which is a town located between Baltimore and Gettysburg. The man in the picture is well known to you students of the Civil War, Major General Joseph Hooker, known by his nom de guerre, Fighting Joe. Fighting Joe is something of an enigma to me, and I think among U.S. Civil War generals. He introduced corps badges to the Army, big plus. He held wild, crazy parties at his headquarters with ladies always hanging out, and they became known as hookers. That's been handed down through history. He had a brief and unsuccessful tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac, wedged in between Ambrose Burnside and George G. Meade. Fighting Joe lost decisively at the 1863 Battle of Chancellorsville, and later that same year in Tennessee, he became the hero of the victorious assault of the Battle of Lookout Mountain, also known as the Battle Above the Clouds. Fighting Joe's personality, he was brash. He had a knack for inflammatory comments. In battle, he was a hero at Missionary Ridge and a goat at Chancellorsville. He died in 1879, missing out on all the media coverage in the 1880s about the time of the 25th anniversary of the war. At that time, the generals on both sides were sharing their memories and recollections and fighting their own new battles, making their cases for how history should remember them and their deeds. Now, back to the photograph. The idea that a Massachusetts-born General Hooker would be pictured on an advertisement for a Maryland photographer left me scratching my head. So I thought I'd go down the research rabbit hole to try to figure out when this was taken and maybe get a sense of why. So first, the inscription on the mount suggests that Fighting Joe sat for this portrait in Everhart's studio. This is untrue. Why do we know this? Because a glass plate negative of this exact view is in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery, and it's credited to Matthew Brady, the father of photojournalism and the well-known Civil War photographer. The photographer Everhart pirated this photo for his own use. Now, he did it at a time when copyright laws for images were really in their infancy. This was back in the 1860s, and pirating images was a common practice. My working theory is that Everhart must have used Fighting Joe's likeness at some point, and that first point could have become when Hooker became commander of the Army of the Potomac. That was in January of 1863. Hooker had just replaced Ambrose Burnside, who failed miserably at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Burnside, as you students of the Civil War know, had replaced George B. McClellan, the charismatic and beloved Little Mac, who moved so cautiously on the Virginia Peninsula and was not quite on top of his game at Antietam, leaving Lincoln to finally put him on the shelf. On January 26, 1863, Lincoln writes a letter to Hooker about the appointment to lead the army. Lincoln, in this letter, famously wrote, quote, "I have heard in such a way as to believe it of your recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain success can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship, end quote. So that's the passage of Lincoln's letter to Hooker. 2 months after that letter was written, the governor of Pennsylvania, he was a great governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, visited the Army of the Potomac and Hooker in winter camp at Falmouth, Virginia. During that visit, Fighting Joe reportedly boasted that he had, quote, the finest army on the planet, end quote. This particular quote was splashed across newspapers around the loyal states. Might Everhart, the Manchester, Maryland photographer, have advertised his gallery with Hooker's likeness following the publication and the publicity around that finest army on the planet quote? Well, I looked into that and I did a review of various newspaper editorials from that particular period, March, April of 1863. And a bunch of them talk about this finest army on the planet quote. And what I was able to pick up from all this was that most of the writers were sort of scratching their heads and a little stumped by Hooker's inaction. But a number of these writers pointed the finger of blame at the Lincoln administration. Here's one example from the New York Daily Herald on April 2nd, 1863. The editorial goes, had General McClellan, of course, that's the original Army of the Potomac commander, last fall, that would have been 1862, been allowed to remain even a week longer at the head of the Army of the Potomac, he would, in all probability, have cleared the way to Richmond. For while he was close upon the rear of Lee on the eastern flank of the Blue Ridge, he had Jackson on the western side cut off. Of course, that's Stonewall Jackson, with the occupation by our troops of the mountain passes through which only he could come to the timely support of Lee. That golden opportunity, however, having been lost, it may be useless to dwell upon it. We are called upon to deal with the matter as it now stands. Why then does not General Hooker advance? We remember the outcry that was raised last spring against the inactivity of McClellan. What are the causes then which still detain General Hooker on the Rappahannock when he boasts himself that he has the finest army on the planet? We think it is likely that he is detained by the superior powers at Washington, and they are pursuing a military policy which it is in vain for ordinary mortals to attempt to comprehend. So when all else fails in the military, blame it on Washington. Based on this editorial and other critical writings, it seems to me Hooker would not have risen to the level of being a hero in early 1863, at least enough of a hero for photographer Everhart to put Hooker's likeness on this image. Of course, just a couple of months after that editorial that I just read to you appeared, Hooker is replaced, and this is just before the Battle of Gettysburg. Hooker, in fact, resigns, and he's replaced by George Gordon Meade. Of course, Gettysburg is July of 1863, and just a few months later, on November 25th in Chattanooga, Fighting Joe's successful assault on Missionary Ridge, Chattanooga, makes him a national hero. Some of the headlines that are splashed across the Union newspapers: General Hooker captured Missionary Ridge and 2,000 prisoners. Hooker carries the north slope of Lookout Mountain. Hooker was victorious in all his movements. Fair to say, Lookout Mountain was Hooker's redemption from Chancellorsville. 3 decades later, after the Battle of Missionary Ridge, at the dedication ceremonies at Chattanooga for the national battlefield, one of the late General Hooker's comrades, Major General Daniel Butterfield, praises Fighting Joe. In his remarks, Butterfield shares a description of Fighting Joe told to him by a veteran. This veteran said, quote, in military operations, Hooker was audacious, original, acute. In executing them, he was energetic, yet circumspect and prudent. He was severe in discipline, exacting in his demands upon officers and men, lofty in his ideal of the soldier's intrepidity, fortitude, earnestness, and zeal. Yet he was generous in praise, quick to see and recognize ability and merit as well in the ranks of his adversary as in his own. A soldier by intuition, instinct, and profession, Hooker's sword was adorned by the best accomplishments known to the art of war. His character, thoroughly military. He was fit for command. He was proud of the profession of arms. He brought to it the highest accomplishments of a soldier. His manner and bearing were distinguished, yet urbane and gentle. His temper was quick yet forgiving. He was gracious to junior officers and prompt to recognize merit, diligent and punctilious in the discharge of duty towards all under his command. He was exacting in discipline, inexorable to the laggard, prodigal in praise to the zealous, and diligent. He always bowed to superior power with the same loyalty that he demanded from his own troops. He never sulked in his tent when summoned to battle. He was a patriot. He loved his country. He loved its defenders. He has passed into history with the great characters of 61 to 65. He filled glorious pages of our American annals. End quote. Wow, what a tribute listened by the audience that had gathered for the dedication ceremonies at Chattanooga, based on the strength of that dedication talk and all the newspaper articles and editorials that I looked at. I have to say, and I have to believe that getting back to this photograph, the reason that we see Hooker's likeness on this photograph from the photographer Everhart in Manchester, Maryland, is likely due to Hooker Fighting Joe's success at the Battle Above the Clouds. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.